This is American Political Thought for the week of April 5th through 9th. And today I'm commenting on chapters 7, 8, and 9 from Volume 1, Part 2 of Democracy in America by de Tocqueville. This is where de Tocqueville steps forward in some ways and becomes the greatest analysis of the psychology and nature of democracy in the modern world, and especially his topic in Chapter 7, the omnipotence of the majority in the United States and its effects. De Tocqueville is the great analyzer of the nature of democratic tyranny. Now, again, in modern times, when the victory of democracy, as de Tocqueville predicted, by the way, is nearly complete. And even in formerly aristocratic countries, or even countries that still have remnants of aristocracy in their ruling structures, such as the British Commonwealth, which, after all, is still presided over by a hereditary crown and still includes a bicameral legislature where one house is still based upon inherited title and privilege. Nevertheless, all modern nations, even the ones that appear to be tyrannical from our point of view, authoritarian or totalitarian, such as the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany or the People's Republic of China or the People's Republic of North Korea, almost all forms, or even the fascist states of Italy in the 1920s and 30s, all of modern communism, fascism, socialism, they all claim to be erected upon the sovereignty of the people. So in that sense, de Tocqueville was, again, prophetic and correct that all modern politics would be in some ways democratic. But that doesn't mean that all modern politics, just because it would be democratic, would be, and even if, as I've already pointed out in several of our discussions, that de Tocqueville in some ways was a partisan of this change. Since, as I pointed out in my discussion of Part 1, Volume 1, Chapter 4 on the sovereignty of the people, de Tocqueville, as I suggested, kind of tips his hand and suggests that even though aristocracy, and as we saw also in Chapter 6 of Part 2, where he compares the nature of aristocracy and democracy, even though born into an aristocratic class, after all, even though he thought that aristocracy had certain good qualities in terms of the conduct of foreign affairs, stability, legislative and administrative stability. Nevertheless, he tips his hand and points out that aristocracy was probably based upon a false assumption of human inequality, and also that it led to a radically unjust situation of a concentration of society's resources for the top 4 or 5%. Even though de Tocqueville, as I'm suggesting here, is the great prophet of the coming of democracy, and in many ways welcomes it, and what he found in America was a moderate and decent version of democracy, he is too clear-minded and too philosophic to understand that democracy always leads to a just result or a good result or even a beautiful result. And as we see in my next discussions, as we kind of summarize Democracy in America in Part 2, he is clear-sighted enough to know that under certain conditions, democracy may lead to a leveling off of the best potentials of the human race, and might lead to, in some ways, a more just society, but in some ways, a incomparably ugly and distorted society. So, prior to this chapter, Chapter 7 of Volume 1, Part 2, you'd have to say that the most trenchant analysis of the tyrannical potentials of democracy was in Federalist 10 by James Madison. And if you remember from our consideration of that essay within the rubric of Storing's of what the Anti-Federalists were for, remember, in some ways, the Anti-Federalists, now we're going to come back to some of their arguments, because it turns out that just because they lost the argument, as Storing argues, if you remember, just because they lost the argument at the founding doesn't mean they had nothing to say, or they didn't have some insightful criticisms of the emergent constitutional republic. But if you remember, the critique of the small Republican community that the Anti-Federalists advocated in Federalist 10 is that it tends to approximate the liabilities of direct democracy. And Madison comes out and says direct democracy is not a good form of government because, first of all, public opinion tends to be raw and unreflective, tends to be the addition of many different private factional opinions, not just this public mind. But that the main problem with democracy, and hence the small republic of the Anti-Federalists, is that there is no check on the will of the majority. So the great problem of democracy, which in some ways can't be solved, it's inherent in this form of government, is the problem of majority tyranny. So what de Tocqueville's account in this, and in some ways the next chapter, and even chapter 9, I'll come back in just a second and suggest the layout of these 3 chapters. But what I'm doing right now is just focusing on its critical centrality. This is probably the most thorough discussion of the nature of democratic tyranny, majority tyranny, in modern writing. What de Tocqueville does, so by the way, these 3 chapters. So let me just back up. Remember, in this whole part of Volume 1, Part 2, is an attempt to show how democracy as a social, political, governmental system works. And just to remind you, Chapter 1, he says America really is a democracy, the majority rules. And remember what he means by that. That once a persistent enough and solid enough majority forms on a subject, no public authority can resist it. It eventually will have its way in American life. And partially that's because of universal suffrage, and also because the core institutions, even the Supreme Court, which is the least responsive to immediate changes in public opinion, since, of course, the court is appointed by the president with the advising consent of the Senate and serves for life. Even the Supreme Court eventually comes around to majoritarian understandings of public policy and everything. It may take a while. So de Tocqueville's point in Chapter 1 of Part 2 is that the institutions of political life vibrate essentially to a strong enough and persistent and widespread and long-lasting enough majority. Not that every complacent, every movement of every movement of whim or passion that affects the nation and may sum a temporary majority, there is a certain sense in which, and this is part of Federalist 10 too, that Republican institutions have a tendency to refine those out. But if there is a majoritarian current, widespread enough and strong enough, it will eventually determine public policy. That's what de Tocqueville means. And then in chapters 2, 3, and 4, in press, parties, and associations, these are the mechanisms by which the majority forms in society, becomes aware of itself, spreads its ideas, and through associations, etc., tries to, and that includes parties, tries to affect public policy. That's how democracy works, even the constitutional Republican democracy of the United States. And then in Chapter 5, he steps back and takes a look at how democracy really works. We looked at that chapter, and although there are some real problems with the democratic societies, nevertheless, de Tocqueville's pretty affirmative of the result. And in Chapter 6, as I've already pointed out in our last discussion, that he kind of brings you up to the mountaintop and then makes you see the advantages of democratic government society versus aristocratic government society, and that's what I like to encapsulate, if you remember, in terms of Walmart versus Versailles. Now, then in Chapter 7 and 8, then, as I already said at the beginning of these remarks, de Tocqueville then turns to the greatest problem of democracy, and that's majority tyranny. Now, I want, and then you'll see in Chapter 8, then in the next chapter, what tempers the tyranny of the majority. There are certain aspects in America's political structure and political culture which somewhat subdue or have a tendency to moderate the overwhelming and irresistible power of the majority, in the interest of justice and better policy, by the way. And then in Chapter 9, a long chapter, de Tocqueville talks about what So here's how to understand the relationship between Chapter 8 and Chapter 9. So Chapter 8 is what are the aspects of the political culture and structure of American government which will temper majority tyranny. And by the way, to give you a head up about Chapter 8, it has much to do with the fact that lawyers dominate in our political culture. More about this in a bit. But lawyers like precedent and procedure and due process, and therefore lawyers, and so much of our society is influenced by and governed by lawyers. This is ultimately a good thing for de Tocqueville, and as you also see, he talks about the educational value of the jury, which teaches people the necessity of due process as a means of justice. De Tocqueville, by the way, as you're going to see in Chapter 8, isn't particularly hot on the civil or criminal efficacy of jury trials. And by the way, within modern law, culture, and discussion, jury verdicts are often are criticized from the standpoint that juries are manipulable, and that they're not always the best fact finding, and that they may not lead to the best criminal and civil result. But de Tocqueville's not interested in the jury from that standpoint. He's interested in what the jury teaches a democratic people about the necessity of fairness and due process. And of course, then the other main thing in Chapter 8 that we'll see that he thinks tempers the tyranny of the majority is the political and administrative decentralization of the American Republic. That the breaking up of political authority into states and localities ultimately is one of the things that restrains the potentially tyrannical will of the majority. Now, in terms of our interest in this class, our general interest is to understand, of course, what is the nature of democracy and its instincts, and especially even its darker instincts, its tyrannical tendencies, and what democratic tyranny, majority tyranny looks like. And I will try to make two connections to contemporary politics, especially as we move in the next material for this coming week, the material in Volume 2, in which he predicts the future of democracy, and as I'm going to suggest, and somewhat anticipates the dominance of a national cancel culture, which, by the way, has been fed by the nationalization and technologicalization of the media. So even though de Tocqueville looked at America and thought the newspapers, that America was the most newspaper-oriented country, of course that's changed but what's changed primarily because of technology. First the rise of radio, and then television, and then the internet has kind of created an instantaneous national media, which in some ways focuses on both centralization and radicalization, which de Tocqueville predicted. But it also means that the possibility of national majority tyranny is even greater now. And I even suggested that you take a look at this episode from the Orville, which was kind of an interesting parody, knockoff, retelling of the Star Trek universe by Seth MacFarlane, who is the creator of Family Guy, etc. But he had already loved Star Trek, and he did this kind of interesting series on called the Orville, which again is both. It's not exactly a parody, not like Galaxy Quest, or an affirmation. It's kind of an homage to Star Trek, but it also has a slightly grittier quality. Well, in this great episode called Majority Rule from, I think it's Season 1, Episode 7, they go to a planet that's very much like 21st century Earth, except it has smartphones and cancel culture. And actually, by the way, also not only does it comment on the emergent cancel culture in this country, this episode about 2 years old, I think, but it also points forward to a society like the People's Republic, because the People's Republic has in fact initiated this series of social punishments and demerits and that's portrayed in this episode. So I think de Tocqueville would see, by the way, the People's Republic as an example of democratic tyranny gone, combined with the other main thing that we'll talk about in Volume 2, which is the rise of the centralized welfare, authoritarian administrative state. So, as you'll see at the end of Volume 1, right at the end of Chapter 10, which we'll come back to later on in this week, de Tocqueville and I started the class out by pointing to the conclusion of the end of Volume 1, which if you remember, was originally, he thought the only thing he was going to write was Volume 1, and then he came back and wrote Volume 2 when his partner, Gustave de Beaumont, turned out the novel that he wrote that wasn't exactly what de Tocqueville wanted in terms of the analysis of American mores and social customs. But if you remember, because I started out the class with that, that's because this is kind of what interested me in political science as an undergraduate in 1973, that de Tocqueville predicted that the world's being split up between Russia and America. Not because there were certain reasons why, but primarily because he thought that the modern democratic world would be offered a choice between two versions of democracy: the individualistic, freedom-oriented, law-determined, Republican, constitutional version of democracy in the United States, and then a kind of a radicalized, authoritarian, centralized administrative tyranny, but nevertheless erected on egalitarian and democratic foundations. So he wouldn't be surprised, in other words, if he came back today and saw that it was China instead of Russia. Because, well, again, and I think the Chinese understand themselves to do this, is they present themselves as our competitors, not just in terms of geopolitical or economic power, but in terms of a model for humanity. And so I think de Tocqueville, again, turns out to be prophetic in terms of what versions of democracy the modern world can choose between, and to tip the hat in terms of his sober and even pessimistic analysis. I think he thinks that the tendency of the modern world will be eventually to transition from our version of democracy into the more radical version, for reasons we'll see in Volume 2. All right, so the nature of majority tyranny, the omnipotence of the majority. So let's turn to page 247, and the first thing that he lays out in this chapter are the assumptions, the conceptual and moral assumptions that give, in a democratic government, society, and culture, the authority of the majority. Where does that come from? And he suggests two primary conceptual sources of the authority of the majority. In the middle of 247, the moral authority of the majority is partially based on the notion that there is more enlightenment and wisdom in a numerous assembly than in a single man, and that the number of the legislators is more important than how they are chosen. It is the theory of equality applied to brains. This doctrine attacks the last asylum of human pride. For that reason, the minority is reluctant in admitting it and takes a long time to get used to it. Like all powers, and perhaps more than any other of them, the power of the majority needs to have proved lasting to appear legitimate. When it is beginning to establish itself, it enforces obedience by constraint. It is only when men have lived long under its laws that they begin to respect it. So by the way, Aristotle in the Politics also discusses this as one of the arguments for democracy, that even if you took King Solomon, the wisest human being ever to have ruled, according to biblical and Western culture, nevertheless, if you take a mass of human beings, they all may be nitwits individually, but if you add up all their nitwitosity, that somehow there'll be a collective wisdom. So this first one, that there's something like pooled enlightenment or pooled wisdom in a majority, in a mass of human beings. And by the way, I should back up and say that the real basis of the majority rule and the authority of the majority is ultimately equality. That is to say, if everyone's equal, I mean, if like in this class where there is an enlightened and remarkably wise, scholarly professor leading the class, as opposed to untutored students, then of course it's not a democracy because the professor knows more. That's the presumption, right? But if you really believe everyone's equal in that scholarship, learning, training, and by the way, Americans are willing to limit arguments for equality of insight based on equality, human equality, when it comes to medical opinion, more or less, to some degree to scientific opinion, legal opinion, as de Tocqueville will point out in Chapter 8. They will respect lawyers and kind of grudgingly admit that lawyers may have a kind of expertise in the law. Doctors, most people who think that everyone's equal will actually listen to an informed doctor's opinion with respect to medical issues, and therefore they do lend a kind of credence and to some degree to science, although it depends on which politician you're talking about, invoking which authority to science. But nevertheless, Americans do kind of respect scientific authority, and probably sports abilities. But beyond that, if you argue that all human beings are essentially equal, then the only way that you can get a group of human beings to do anything who are equal is to add up the major number. It's literally a kind of a physics argument. That if you have, and this is the way I explain American government, that if you have a seesaw or a teeter-totter, and with a fulcrum in the middle, the only way to get it tipped to one side, if you're putting equal ping pong balls on either one, is to put one more ping pong ball on one side, and that will tip it. Well, in a way, if you start out with equality, which is the foundation, of course, of democracy, then you kind of end up with the majority rule. And of course, the whole point that de Tocqueville is doing in this chapter is that presumption of equality leading to majority rule, like all concentration of power in one set of hands, whether that's a tyrannical king, a tyrannical legislature, a tyrannical judiciary, as Federalist 51 points out, by the way that you limit that kind of tyranny on the institutional level is the separation of powers and checks and balances. But on the social level, even the concentration of power in a majority can lead to omnipotence, and as de Tocqueville is going to suggest, anytime you get human beings, whether it's a one person, a king, a dictator, a monarch, an emperor, or a legislature, a civic body, or even the majority in society, once you get unqualified power, omnipotence, you've got tyranny. And so again, the great thing in this chapter is to see the psychological underpinnings and psychological and social and governmental effects of majority tyranny. On the bottom of 247, so in addition to human equality and the idea that there's kind of pooled collective wisdom in a majority or in a mass of human beings, he also adds another point at the bottom of 247 and the top of 248. The moral authority of the majority is also founded on the principle that the interest of the greatest number should be preferred to that of those who are fewer. Now, it is easy to understand that the respect professed for this right of the greatest number naturally grows or shrinks according to the state of the parties. A little bit further on 248. Hence, the majority in the United States has immense actual power, and a power of opinion which is almost as great. When once its mind is made up on any questions, there are, so to say, no obstacles which can retard, much less halt, its progress and give it time to hear the wails of those it crushes as it passes. The consequences of this state of affairs are fate-laden and dangerous for the future. Let's see how you get from these presumptions about the nature of the authority of the majority into what happens psychologically, socially, and politically when a majority becomes tyrannical, and what it means for a majority to be tyrannical. Look on the next section on the middle of page 250. I regard it as an impious and detestable maxim that in matters of government the majority of a people has the right to do everything, and therefore I place the origin, and nevertheless, I place the origin of all powers in the will of the majority. Am I in contradiction with myself? Again, this is a real tension within democracy and perhaps all society. How are you going to decide how to do things? Well, if everyone's equal and has equal needs, then probably the will of the majority. But again, once you get concentrated power on any set of human beings, and the idea that simply because it is the majority, that whatever the majority wants is right, means that you bump up against the purpose of society as justice. So in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, by the way, that's where Lincoln tended to counter Stephen Douglas by arguing that the majority has a right to everything except something wrong. So how do we get to majority will or majority rule to majority tyranny? On page 251. What is a majority in its collective capacity if not an individual, with opinions and usually with interests contrary to those of another individual, called a minority? Now, if you admit that a man vested with omnipotence can abuse it against his adversaries, why not admit the same concerning a majority? Have men, by joining together, changed their character? By becoming stronger, have they become more patient of obstacles? For my part, I cannot believe that, and I will never grant to several the power to do everything which I refuse to a single man. So if a dictator, a single dictator, can be tyrannical, can't the majority part of a society? And by the way, you're going to see when we turn to the question, go back to the question of race, in chapter 10, the three races that inhabit America, de Tocqueville is going to suggest that, in fact, there is something like majority tyranny of the white race over the Native Americans and the African Americans. More about that later. So on this long passage of 252, you get so what translates majority will or majority rule into majority tyranny is ultimately omnipotence. On page 252, omnipotence is itself in itself seems to be a bad and dangerous thing. I think that its exercise is beyond man's strength, whoever he be, and that only God can be omnipotent without danger, because his wisdom and justice are always equal to his power. So there is no power on earth in itself so worthy of respect or vested with such a sacred right that I would wish to let it act without control and dominate without obstacles. So when I see the right and capacity to all given to any authority whatsoever, whether it be called a people or king, democracy or aristocracy, and whether the scene of action is a monarchy or a republic, I say, the germ of tyranny is there, and I will go look for other laws under which to live. My greatest complaint against democratic government as organized in the United States is not, as many Europeans make out, its weakness, but rather its irresistible strength. What I find most repulsive in America is not the extreme freedom reigning there, but the shortage of guarantees against tyranny, democratic tyranny. When a man or a party suffers an injustice in the United States, to whom can he turn? To public opinion? That is what forms the majority. To the legislative body, it represents the majority and obeys it blindly. To the executive power, it is appointed by the majority and serves as its passive instrument. To the police, they are nothing but the majority under arms. The jury is the majority vested with the right to pronounce judgment. Even the judges in certain states are elected by the majority. So however iniquitous or unreasonable a measure which hurts you, you must submit. And then in one of the darkest and in some ways also clear-sighted analysis of the nature of democratic or majority tyranny on page 255 to 256. This is one of the central passages in the entire book. Formerly, tyranny used the clumsy weapons of chains and hangmen. Nowadays, even despotism, though it seems to have nothing more to learn, has been perfected by civilization. Princes made violence a physical thing, but our contemporary democratic republics have turned it into something as intellectual as the human will it is intended to constrain. Under the absolute government of a single man, despotism, to reach the soul, clumsily struck at the body, and the soul, escaping from such blows, rose gloriously above it. But in democratic republics, that is not all how tyranny behaves. It leaves the body alone sometimes. By the way, let's be clear that probably the ugliest version of majority tyranny in the United States was the lynching from 1880 to about the beginning of World War I, where 5,000 African American men, women, and children were lynched and murdered, which by democratic top mobs. So even though he's arguing that the core force of democratic tyranny is psychological rather than physical, a lynch mob that demands immediate action can be just as tyrannical as a single prince, and it can resort to physical violence, as we saw in the segregated South under Jim Crow. More about that, by the way, when we turn to the issue of the three races. But in democratic republics, that is not how tyranny behaves. It leaves the body alone and goes straight for the soul. The master no longer says, think like me or you die. He does say, you are free not to think as I do. You can keep your life and property and all. But from this day on, you are a stranger among us. You can keep your privileges in the township, but they will be useless to you. For if you solicit your fellow citizens' votes, they will not give them to you. And if you only ask for their esteem, they will make excuses for refusing that. You will remain among men, but you will lose your rights to count as one. When you approach your fellows, they will shun you as an impure being, and even those who believe in your innocence will abandon you too, lest they in turn be shunned. Go in peace. I have given you your life, but it is a life worse than death. In that passage, de Tocqueville details, and again, his remarkable ability to understand the psychology of certain forms of government and political ideas. And so, because in a democratic society, the majority is literally the major part of society, its forces over freedom of thought, over the individual, over the minority, are not so much punitive and coercive in the direct sense, although they can include that, but it's more psychological and social. So one problem with democratic tyranny is that it's almost impossible to escape its influence because the people, the majority, is all around you. So in some ways, what about desperate minorities, by the way? On page 260. If ever freedom is lost in America, that will be due to the omnipotence of the majority driving the minorities to desperation and forcing them to appeal to physical force. We may see then anarchy, but it will have come as the result of despotism. And by the way, de Tocqueville ends chapter 7 by quoting, of course, Madison, which you can't exactly go wrong with. So there you have the nature of majority will as it morphs into majority tyranny in a democracy. This is always a tendency, always a possibility in democratic societies. And in particular, what I want to suggest, and this is what I think one of the things I want you to take away from this course, is that, for instance, I think that de Tocqueville's analysis of majority tyranny, majority will, and majority tyranny is more useful as a framework for understanding racial relations in the United States. We'll come back to this when we talk about chapter 10 in this section of the book, and also as we examine race from literally the Civil War through the. By the way, the next reading, in addition to chapter 10 and the rest of volume 2, is the great storing piece on Booker T. Washington. Now, as you'll see, that piece is actually a report of the debate between W.E. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, the two greatest African-American leaders, between, as I mentioned in my email, between Frederick Douglass and the rise of the Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s and 60s. So I want to suggest that the rubrics of white supremacy, which I think have relatively little analytical foundation for them, and probably may or may not. Again, when we look at different authors in the next month to conclude the class, we can see different takes on this. But my view is it's a much more useful framework for understanding the tensions that, for instance, African Americans and other ethnic minorities, and by the way, for that even religious minorities. I mean, after all, I'm an Orthodox Jew, and even though I converted, I've lived my life as an Orthodox Jew in all places of the South, which is the most Christianly religious part of the country. So I understand a lot of what de Tocqueville's talking about in terms of the effect of the minority. Now, what I want to suggest in terms of this class is that once you grasp what de Tocqueville's analyzing in terms of the tendencies of a democracy, you'll see that many of the bad effects of race relations in the United States aren't because of some incipient sense that white people are superior to black people, but the simple fact that white people constitute the majority in this country. In other words, by the way, many of the racial inequities and racial tensions that come in a society come from the fact that it is a democracy. And nobody saw that more clearly, I think, than de Tocqueville, as you will see when we discuss the material in chapter 10. So to finish this discussion of majority tyranny, with chapter 8 then, he turns to the question, okay, if that's an inherent tendency in all modern democracy, what tempers it? What can restrain it? And again, here on and so as I already kind of gave you a heads up, the primary things that he discusses in this chapter that restrain majority tyranny are the lack of administrative centralization. So understand, de Tocqueville predicted that American politics would become more politically and administratively centralized, and so he thinks at this point one of the things that restrains the dangerous tendency of a national majority is the federal structure or the devolution of power to the state, local, and municipal authorities. On page 263 in Chapter 8, it is worth thinking about this point. If ever a democratic republic similar to that of the United States came to be established in a country in which earlier a single man's power had introduced administrative centralization and had made it something accepted by custom and law, I have no hesitation in saying that in such a republic despotism would become more intolerable than in any of the absolute monarchies of Europe. One would have to go over to Asia to find anything. And by the way, that passage is the key to understanding his statement at the end of Volume 1 about the coming dominance of America and Russia. Let me just fill this analysis out a little bit. De Tocqueville wrote another work not long after Democracy in America called The Ancien Régime et la Révolution Française, the Ancient Regime and the French Revolution. His thesis was, why did the French democratic revolution quickly become so radicalized, so murderous, and so totalitarian? It's because the Bourbon monarchy was had actually created the police state, much like the Shah in Iran, or Saddam Hussein, or the Tsar for that matter, or for that matter, as you'll see, in China. So de Tocqueville's point in the old regime in the French Revolution is that if you have a country that's used to administrative centralization, the concentration of all government, where government is both supervisory and controlling, and headed by a despot, all you have to do is chop the head of the despot off, which of course is what the French did in 1789, and what the Russians did after with the Tsar and his family. They shot them to death in the basement, including, by the way, Anastasia. But the problem is, once you then replace this despotic head of a centralized administrative state with a radicalized democratic ideology, then what you get is more autocracy, more totalitarianism, only now, because it's democratic, and you add what we just added about majority tyranny, it becomes perhaps the most oppressive of all conditions in human history. And you'll see, by the way, at the end of Volume 2, when de Tocqueville in Chapter 6 of Volume 1, Part 4, talks about what kind of despotism. It's the radical democracy under a centralized American state. So to go back to what tempers the will of the majority in this chapter, as long as America has these kind of decentralized policies, both political and especially administrative decentralization, then that will temper the democratic and tyrannical power of a national majority. But and he predicted that we would, in fact, eventually become more centralized, and that all of politics would be concentrated more in a national center, and that more of life would come under administrative rubric for reasons we will see in Volume 2. Then that's why he ends Volume 1 with this two potential democracies, one liberal, one tyrannical. And the key to it is the passage I just read you on page 263. In addition to administrative and political decentralization, tempering, but again, you'll see that when you see the little Orville episode, what happens when technology bypasses the decentralization of the American newspaper environment and federalism and everything? Because, of course, with our nationalized media, and especially with social media, we now create a common national mind that instantly responds to shifts in passion and even persecutorial passions. And you're going to see, that's what I want to suggest is the nature of cancel culture. It's actually a national democratic tyranny expressing itself instantaneously and ruthlessly on both the national and even local levels. So anyway, also then in 264, etc., the legal profession, because lawyers and doctors, as I already mentioned, are kind of like the gods of American life. You can tell by what kind of complimentary political television programs, like Boston Law or Grey's Anatomy. In other words, when a television entertainment became, the dominant form of entertainment in the 50s and 60s, you had westerns. What did you have? You had variety shows and entertainment shows. You had news. You had Western, doctor, and lawyer shows. Eventually, Westerns kind of faded because of the critique of the frontier mentality and sort of like in Dances with Wolves, Westerns became out of fashion because they became politically incorrect. But then into the 80s, 90s, and 100s, and even today, you still have doctor shows and lawyer shows where they're the heroes. And Tocqueville points out that because we're such a legal society, we give a lot of authority to lawyers, and what lawyers like. They're the closest thing to an aristocratic class, he says, in America. And what lawyers like is precedent. They like procedure, due process, and that tempers, as we said, some of the aspects. Because at least if you have to turn, there is a difference between a lynch mob and a trial. And therefore, Americans sense that lawyers somehow are in control of due process does occasionally temper a tyrannical majority's will. And again, the jury, especially in pages 274 to 75, where he's not saying the jury is a great thing for like getting to the truth or justice of a particular case. But what a jury does is teach democratic citizens of the necessity of being careful and paying attention to facts and legal precedent and due process. So he embraces the jury as an institution that tempers majority tyranny in American life by teaching Americans that you have to stop and think before you decide on controversial issues. All right, Chapter 9. The title of Chapter 9 is Causes Tending to Maintain a Democratic Republic. So, because de Tocqueville essentially found, with by the way, as we're going to see, with the exception of race, which he's pretty critical of the white majority, as a democratically tyrannical majority in Chapter 10, as we'll see. But remember, going back to like the point of departure in Volume 1, Part 1, Chapter 1, and what he, in the kind of, de Tocqueville said, even though this is a society founded on equality and founded on the abolition of permanent classes, de Tocqueville thought that the Americans had managed to produce a fairly decent society where even an aristocrat could look at it and say it's not Versailles, it's not the peak of human effort and the peak of human profession, but at least the kind of low and solid comforts that America makes possible to the everyday person kind of does raise the common element of humanity up to a kind of a decent level. And therefore de Tocqueville's asking in what aspects of American life, more from the standpoint of mores, will actually help preserve this kind of combination of democratic social will that combines with legality and personal freedom and responsibility, which is what he thought the best thing that America had created. Sort of like, regardless of who won in the founding debate between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, this idea that the typical American was a pretty self-reliant, pretty law-abiding, pretty good, decent human being. So de Tocqueville is asking in this question, what aspects of the American social life, can preserve these good aspects of democratic republicanism? And again, as I point out in the notes, here he's beginning to sound more like the Anti-Federalists. And as you're going to see, especially in Volume 2, when he's talking about what will restrain this decay of American politics into the centralized welfare state, where everything will be concentrated in a national center and where Americans' lives will be administered and ordered about rather than sort of lived on the individual level. He and his primary argument, which sounds, by the way, like the Anti-Federalists, is that this kind of republicanism can only survive where people have a vibrant Republican life, where they're engaged in their local communities, where they have some kind of responsibility for the world around them. And here, by the way, he thinks primarily this is going to be in the world of mores, of social customs, in the fourth part of the regime. Remember, a regime consists of ideas, institutions, laws, and policies, and the society. He thinks that perhaps it will be in the peripheral elements, the social customs and habits, the mores of society, that our ability to preserve a democratic republic will consist of. And look on page 305, by the way, as a nice statement on the importance of social customs or mores for the preservation of political decency. The laws contribute more to the maintenance of democratic republic than do the physical circumstances of the country, and mores more than the laws. Even though, by the way, the laws, and by that he means the structure of institutions, as we already saw, the administrative and political decentralization, etc. More about that later in Volume 2. But he thinks that, in some ways, and this goes back to the point of departure in Volume 1, Part 1, Chapter 2. The fact that it was the Puritans, and therefore American community was born with this participatory dimension, under the rule of law, and with deliberation. So what are the two kinds of things that may preserve that in American life in the future? He turns to religion, and the power of religion. And that religion, interestingly enough, and this is where he points out that in Europe, the French Revolution became radical and secular and angry, and not only killed everyone, but also tore down the church and was anti-religious. And therefore, many people in Europe consider that democracy was inconsistent with religion. But what de Tocqueville argues is, because America was founded with the separation of church and state, religion lost a certain institutional power, as opposed to, for instance, the Church of England, which is still the official religion of England, or in quasi-established countries like Spain or Italy, although the Catholic Church has lost much of its authority in countries like Ireland, Spain, Italy, not so much in Poland for political reasons. But he argues that religion detached from political power, when it becomes a social force, will help to preserve this kind of American sense of personal responsibility, liberty, and individual freedom under law. And then, as he points out, by the way, if you read this whole chapter, he knows that the coming ages are going to be scientific, materialistic. He will talk more about this in Volume 2. And therefore, as, by the way, the evidence seems to be suggesting, because organized religion, except for immigrant Muslim communities and Orthodox Jewish communities in Europe, has all but collapsed. Europe is pretty much on its way to being the kind of secular society that de Tocqueville predicted all modern democracies would be, because of the victory of science, and in some ways the diminished power of institutional religion. But, as he points out, even though Americans had separation of church and states, almost all Americans were religious. And this therefore tempered some of their short-sighted, materialistic individual impulses and tied them to larger community. And if you remember, the Anti-Federalists also thought that the preservation of religious sentiment may, in fact, help maintain a certain amount of social and political decency among a Republican citizenry. So, by the way, there's a wonderful little reflection in page 296 to 297, why human beings have inclined to religious faith. And note, by the way, that this openness to religious faith doesn't necessarily mean that the coming ages of humanity are going to be religious. More about that in a second. The short space of 60 years can never shut in the whole of man's imagination. The incomplete joys of this world will never satisfy his heart. Alone among all created beings, man shows a natural disgust for existence and an immense longing to exist. He scorns life and fears annihilation. These different instincts constantly drive his soul towards contemplation of the next world, and it is religion that leads him thither. Religion, therefore, is the only one particular form of hope, and it is natural to the human heart for hope itself. So, in other words, in the very construction of human life, the fact that we're animals and we're mortal, yet, unlike animals, we're aware of our own mortality, and therefore we both fear death, know it's coming, and hope for something beyond it. That's the seed of religious faith. And de Tocqueville thinks probably that's why human beings have always inclined towards accept the authority of religions and the consolation that religion offers. But that doesn't mean that religion's going to always be around, because there can be other things, like, for instance, a frenetic and frenzied absorption in material goods, sort of like in Brave New World, can kind of distract people from the next life. So even though the instinct for religion is in humanity, that doesn't necessarily in the coming ages of humanity that religion will survive. In fact, de Tocqueville predicts that as modernity unfolds, humanity will become more and more secular. Now, whether that's good or bad, that's a different issue overall. But at least de Tocqueville thinks that as long as religious virtue and sentiment and community is preserved in society, that will have a tendency to restrain the more radical and tyrannical tendencies of democracy and preserve the republican form of government in the coming ages. Now, the other thing that he suggests is enlightenment and the idea of rights, which he has a remarkable passage on And here by enlightenment, as you're going to see, he means the Enlightenment, the movement of the Enlightenment that produced the political ideas that shaped the coming future democratic society of humanity. And the as I suggested again, by enlightenment, he literally means the primary ideas of the European Enlightenment. Its influence, its rational and scientific influence, its idea of tolerance, etc. De Tocqueville thinks that to some degree that has spread a certain amount of enlightenment among modern democratic peoples, including Americans, but there are limits to that. And you might want to look, by the way, look back on in Chapter 6 of Volume 1, Part 2, the idea of rights in the United States. He thinks that the core idea of rights you can take and you kind of elevate both to kind of a principle of self-confidence and individual liberty, at the same time a certain attention to the needs of others. But again, it also turns out that that idea of rights can become persecutorial and tyrannical. And as we'll see, by the way, this idea that there's a certain level of enlightenment among the people, that they understand how their own lives are geared towards securing their rights, at the same time respecting others' rights. That's a kind of a byproduct of modern culture, and American culture for that matter. But it also needs to be fostered, and for that you need a certain way of life too. So as we're going to see, de Tocqueville will predict that the likely political conditions of humanity in the future will probably not be able to support the kind of democratic republic that he thinks America has shown the world. And for that, we'll see how his analysis comes together in our next discussion in the different strands of Volume 2 that I'll pull together. And I'll just give you a hint. It's because, as you'll see in Volume 1, Part 2, Chapter 1, when it comes to liberty and equality, the twin foundations of the concept of rights as revealed in the Declaration and in the modern notion of rights, de Tocqueville predicts that psychologically democratic peoples will come to love equality over liberty and will eventually be willing to sacrifice liberty for the sake of equality. More about that in our discussion of Volume 2.